Okay, good morning, everyone. My name is Sabrina, and on behalf of Choice, I'd like to welcome you to today's program, Innovative Teaching, Exploring Women's Histories with Newly Digitized Primary Source Archives and Media, which is sponsored by Clarivate. This session is one in a series of sponsored webinars from Choice that addresses new ideas and developments of interest to the academic library community. I'll just put a couple links in the chat where you can register for upcoming webinars and watch previous webinar recordings. Before we get started, I'd like to point out just a few features of the webinar software. All attendees who join the presentation are automatically muted and your cameras are off, so don't worry about generating any noise or feedback. We've got that taken care of for you. In the main area of the screen, you can follow along with the presentation materials. To adjust the size of the slides or video, you can use the divider in the middle of the screen to slide the sizes to your liking. We are using the Q&A feature today. Please use it to submit questions or comments for our speakers. We'll answer as many questions as we have time for at the end of the presentation, so please do type your questions into the Q&A module as they occur to you. You can also use the upvote feature to highlight questions you'd like or would like to be addressed. Also, there's closed captioning available for today's session. To toggle the automated captions on or off, please use the Show Captions button on the bottom panel of your screen. You can also turn on automated translation for captions by clicking the arrow button, toggling on translation, and selecting your preferred language. Last, please note that we are recording today's program and everyone who registered should receive a follow-up email with a link to the recording. And with that, we are ready to get started, so I will hand it over to Jody.
Thank you so much, Sabrina, and thank you everyone who's joined us for today's webinar. It is entitled Innovative Teaching, Exploring Women's Histories with Newly Digitized Primary Source Archives and Media. I am Jody Johnson. I am the product marketing manager for ProQuest Digital Collections, and the resources that we're going to see today are available through ProQuest Digital Collections and the underlying ProQuest One Women's Studies. I'm joined today by my colleague, Samantha Librano. Sam is the product manager for several key primary source portfolios, including Women's Studies, Black Studies, and Anthropology. Sam is going to be monitoring the chat today, and she will also be moderating the Q&A session at the end. So if you have any questions for our panelists or about the resources that they are presenting or that ProQuest offers, please feel free to drop them in the chat at any time. And today we do have a very exciting lineup for you. I'm so pleased to get to introduce this expert panel of faculty scholars who will be sharing inspiring approaches to teaching women's history using these newly digitized resources. So I'm going to start by giving a brief introduction about all of our presenters, and then I'll turn the floor over to our first presenter, who will be Dr. Patricia Schechter. Dr. Schechter is professor of history at Portland State University. 2025 marks her first year as serving as editor of the biannual online journal publication, Women and Social Movements in the U.S. since 1600. Her expertise spans women's labor, leadership, transnational activism. She is also the author of El Terrible, a new transnational history, which is focused on labor and reform movements in a mining town in Spain. So very interesting work there. Welcome, Dr. Schechter. Our next presenter will be Dr. Jill Jensen. Dr. Jensen is lecturer and scholar in residence at the University of Redlands. She is the editor of Women's and Social Movements Development and the Global South, 1919 through 2019. This is a curated primary source archive and a scholarly database. She's definitely going to be explaining about that during her presentation. She also specializes in the history of capitalism and global labor, and she is the co-editor of the ILO From Geneva to the Pacific Rim. And then finally, our last presenter today will be Dr. Carrie Baker. Scholar, lawyer, and journalist at Smith College. She holds the Sylvia Glutaglash, and Carrie, please forgive my pronunciation there, the Bauman Chair of American Studies. She's also the chair of the program for the study of women, gender, and sexuality, and she is a contributing editor at Ms. Magazine. Her latest book, Abortion Pills, U.S. History and Politics, is available via open access from Amherst College Press. And Dr. Baker, we are so pleased to have you here with us. Each of the presenters today are going to be talking about the work that they're doing right now and how they're using digitized primary sources in their research or in the classroom. And while the presentations today will highlight specific primary source archives, the insights shared will be beneficial whether you support research, instruction, or collection development. So on that note, let's turn it over to our speakers. Dr. Schechter, uh, please take it away.
Thank you, Jody, and thank you, everyone. It's an honor to be here with you today, live from Portland, Oregon. It's really a special opportunity to speak, I believe, primarily to librarians today. Not only am I a historian, I have a PhD in history and published a number of works quite squarely in African-American women's history for most of my career, including a book on Ida B. Wells Barnett. But I also have a degree in library science. I have a credential in archives and records management, and over my career at PSU, we've done a lot of collection development. And so my position as editor of Women in Social Movements in the United States in 1600 was an especially good fit, because not only do I do research and publishing as a scholar, I have some chops in the librarian world and archival world as well. And so what I want to highlight as I get started here is for those of you who are unfamiliar with Women in Social Movements in the US, is we are a publication, fully digital publication that publishes scholarly essays that are attached to curated sets of primary source documents. So you'll see teaching with document projects. When I say document projects, I mean these sort of package presentations online of scholarship in relationship, in dialogue with specific documents, hyperlinked, in fact, to a document set. And the other sort of pillar of Women in Social Movements are primary source sets, kind of somewhat standalone. So on particular themes, we have very, very strong representations around activism, especially the women's suffrage movement and African-American women's history. So that's what I'll be referring to about how to engage students and teach with these sort of two types of materials. So next slide, please. So yeah, so I think one of the exciting things about the way Women in Social Movements is set up is that these two pillars of materials, the document projects, which have scholarship and primary sources, and these document sets, they're completely interoperable. That is, you can get hits from either bucket, depending on how you do your searches. So here's where our library science and training of students is really important. And so in the kinds of questions that I ask my students, they're often going to start with a topic rather than a highly sophisticated research question, which is how our contributing authors frame their work. And so they might look for things like, voting or civil rights, or in the case of the slide you see in front of you, the idea of the minimum wage. So when I teach the survey, it's quite news to students. Minimum wage, a federal minimum wage, seems so absolutely normal and unquestionable, part of our political firmament. But in fact, it was a long, hard-fought battle historically. And indeed, the idea of a minimum wage was a woman's issue. It was largely championed by female activists in the late 19th and early 20th century. So if you take a student and you send them to Women in Social Movements and they type in, they're like, wow, that's interesting, I'm going to type in minimum wage. Well, they'll get thousands of hits. And of course, this is the perennial challenge with, digital online searching. But the good news and a real selling point for Women in Social Movements is it has an extremely robust set of search tools. And so what I've highlighted on this screen is, you get, you search for the minimum wage and you literally get thousands of hits. But if you simply hover your cursor over one of the documents that you can see on the left-hand side of that screenshot, you just hover, a box opens up with hyperlinks to the phrase minimum wage. So you can get laser close to what your student or you are looking for very, very quickly. So rather than be completely overwhelmed by getting 12,000 hits, and indeed, Women in Social Movements has over 250,000 pages at your fingertips, you get this really flexible and robust search engine that I put the red arrow on. It just highlights within individual documents where the phrase minimum wage comes up. How brilliant is that? Next slide, please. So yeah, so again, students will look for things, and of course, they need a little coaching on how to optimize their search chops, their search skills. So for under-document projects, which are these more curated scholarly bites out of historical questions, you're able to search those individual document projects or the set of them. If you put in voting, you get 4 hits. But if you put in suffrage, you get 17. So this is just a little highlight of how, again, coaching students around searching is really important, and how rich Women in Social Movements is, particularly on the subject of women's suffrage. So just a little reminder there. Next slide, please. So if you are able to, your student or your assignment is able to get people to a document project pretty easily, you will be able to get them to a document project pretty easily. You'll see 17 document projects. So it's like, what do you do with that? So there's 17, but like, where's my state? Or there's 17 document projects, but what do you really do with that? Well, one wonderful way to bring this to life for students is that you can assign or encourage them to read a case study like this wonderful one on Colorado, about referendum and constitutional amendments in the late 19th century. And then you can send them to the online, one of these document sets, our online biographical dictionary of the women's suffrage movement. They can find their state, they can find people who worked in their state, and all of that material is, again, cross-referenced and hyperlinked to primary sources. So there's this kind of interoperability between document sets and the primary source standalones within WASM, which makes it really robust. You don't have to go hither, thither, and yon to find your state. It's all right in this material. So I think it's a really great introduction to online research for students. Next slide, please. And again, one of the things I really want to draw attention to in this audience this morning is the exceptionally robust offerings in African American women's history within Women in Social Movements. It is both the largest single collection we have. The Black Women Suffragist collection is the largest in terms of pages. It also, according to our data, gets the most visits and the most hits online. So it's just a really strong feature of this collection. And so here's just a sample of some of the richness under that sort of search string. Here's the Crisis magazine, the publication of the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People in 1917. They did a roundtable on the question of women's suffrage, which of course was not passed by constitutional amendment until 1919 and ratified 1920. And you'll get lots of students will get lots of hits, but if they go into the individual documents, they'll find enormous diversity. So within the Crisis, in this special issue, for example, you have men and women commenting on women's suffrage. You have white folks and Black folks commenting on women's suffrage. You have people from all different parts of the country commenting. So it's just, I just wanted to draw a special attention to the richness there, and far from a simple question of, what were the good reasons for opposing or advancing women's suffrage. There were a wide variety. Different groups of women wanted the vote for different reasons. And that is important to recognize. While they were sort of unified under a banner, they had slightly different reasons and different levels of urgency, if you will. And you can get to that richness very, very quickly through Women in Social Movements. Next slide, please. Yeah, so just to sum up, like any other tool, students benefit, in my experience, from scaffolding when asked to engage with a tool like Women in Social Movements in the US. So step by step, because they're used to Googling, they're used to this sort of highly, general kind of searching. So having them walk through some steps. But as usual with digital online research, finding the right keywords is important. But again, I think exceptionally well supported through this document project format by robust cross-referencing, hyperlinking, and interoperability. Again, big shout out for writings by Black women suffragists in our collection, most downloads and most hits in the thousands within Women in Social Movements. And your fellow librarians or your faculty may or may not be fluent in this resource. So it benefits from partnership because new things are coming online all the time, and just kind of collaborating around how to foster best practices for your student population, for your users, has been very rich in our experience at Portland State. Final plug before I wrap up: publish with us. If there's any researchers or historians in the room, librarians too, we're very democratic at Women in Social Movements. If you've got an idea, you got a document set that needs an audience, that's ready to find users in the world, please contact me. Please contact Women in Social Movements. I'm easy to find on our website. And again, thank you. Look forward to your questions, and just thank you so much for having me this morning.
An overwhelmingly positive responses coming in there, Dr. Schechter. Thank you so much for that thoughtful presentation about this. Again, it's a bi-yearly online journal and about how you use it to teach women's leadership and activism. As Dr. Schechter mentioned, this is shaped by a global community of scholars. She definitely has the publish with us right there on the screen. More than 2,000 authors, many of them are faculty from over 30 countries, represent a wide range of institutions and disciplines. So if you are joining from a university or a library today, I encourage you to see if a scholar from your own institution is involved, either as a contributor or on the editorial team. And if you are unsure where to go to find that information, then please reach out to us in chat. If we are not able to respond today, we will surely get back to you, because we'd love to show you how your university might be being represented with scholars all over the world. Thank you again, Dr. Schechter. And now we're going to shift focus a little bit, and we're going to explore women's history in a global context, particularly in relation to transnational development and activism. So let's turn it over to Dr. Jill Jensen. And Dr. Jensen, we would love to hear about your work. Oh, I'm sorry, but before we toss it to Dr. Jensen, again, the materials that we just saw for Dr. Schechter are available through a trial, and the materials that Dr. Jensen is going to talk about are also available right now in ProQuest Digital Collections and ProQuest One Women's Studies. So if you are interested in exploring these yourself through a trial, that's easy to do through the poll question that you might see pop up on the screen. Thank you so much. And with that, Dr. Jill Jensen.
Thank you so much for this webinar. This is just a fabulous thing to talk about. It's great for us to be able to highlight the work we've been doing for many years. Quite honestly, this has been a labor of love. Sam knows we've been working together on this for quite a while. So thank you for the hosts. Thank you for the topic. My name is Jill Jensen. I teach in California at a small university called the University of Redlands, and I'm a specialist in labor and internationalism. I look at markets, global markets, and especially the global division of labor in this particular case. The database that I have been working on for quite a few years now is part of the Women in Social Movements Library, as we call it, which has a few different sets of collections, including the one that Patricia talked about. There's another one that is Women in Empire, Modern Empire, but this is a third that is coming into it. So I'm very happy to be part and parcel of this, database set. What Women in Social Movements Development in the Global South is about is women's experience globally in their opportunities, economic opportunities, jobs, but also balancing that with life. And obligations with raising families and other things within society. I really think that this is an opportunity for us to historicize these experiences of women. And the women's movement was truly a global phenomenon. And this database gives us a chance to see that correlation between, as Jody said, the transnationalism that goes on between women in different countries, which was cooperative and also in certain times was a little bit conflicting. So historicizing global development and transnational feminist leadership, I think, is just a good little way to describe it from the start. Next slide. But during this talk, I'm actually going to speak about a specific collection that we are in the process of digitizing. Some of it is already on the website, but some of it is still in processing. But we were so lucky, I will have to say, to find these papers from a scholar and an activist, a global scholar and activist. Her name is Irene Tinker. Irene is still alive. She's been active since the 1950s, as you'll see a little bit here. But she graduated from Radcliffe College, got a PhD in the London School of Economics. You can see some of the details there. But she thinks about comparative government and development issues, women, employment, civic engagement, and also urban development, urban design. She's was a forerunner in what was called the Equity Policy Research Center in Washington, D.C. that was thinking about women's issues. And also, I think I have this on the next slide as well, the International Center for Research in Women. But this collection is immense, just really rich, that has so many different details to it from the University of Illinois Archive. They've been really wonderful in working with us, so we're really appreciative of that. Next slide. Irene Tinker was also in her earlier life a very adventurous person. When she was working on her PhD, I think it was that she took that picture from the last slide. She took a drive with her soon-to-be husband from India back to London for her schooling. And she wrote a book called Leadership and Political Institutions in India. That wasn't the first time, the only time she did that. She also went through Africa, and she wrote another book called In Crossing Centuries, a road trip through colonial Africa. But what those experiences gave her was really this insight into the world around her and the way that women and men lived their lives in many different countries. So the International Center for Research on Women really wanted to uncover some of those details and to bring the conversation about women's struggles and women's fights for rights on a global scale. This is one of the later books that she wrote, just to kind of highlight some of her work, Visioning an Equitable World. She also had another book that I'll mention in just a moment that was about street foods and how women that are feeding, populations in the streets as with informal labor is, another one. Next slide. But beyond Tinker herself, this collection offers such an insight into all sorts of activism, because Irene Tinker was a scholar. She taught at University of California, Berkeley for many years, but she was also very, very involved in policy analysis. So the collection is not just her writing. The collection is in no way, really even focused on herself, but it is focused on the activity of so many different women in so many different groups. So as you would see, the librarians and the archivists that might be here, you go into the collection, and these were big boxes, I'll be honest. They were packed full of all sorts of material, but there's one on the left, box 75, that I spent a fair amount of time working on. And there's small time publications and, mimeographed just newsletters. There are, early letters from individuals. This box contained something from groups that were starting the Self-Employed Women's Association, SIWA, which is now still a global institution that has millions of women involved, women that aren't necessarily in formal work, but are doing work every single day in their home and other places around. So this box probably had about 5,000 pages inside of it, if you could imagine that. And we had the opportunity to really engage with all of those things as we are putting together the digital archive, the digital database with all of these. You go in and you see the folders as they were in the archives themselves. So it gives you just this feeling of being somewhere as you are using the primary source material. Next slide, please. As I said, Tinker was involved in thinking about women's lives as they lived them, and thinking about what their experiences were. So there's all these small time, publications, as I said, this case study of the Philippines, one example. There's another one that is from Java, in Indonesia and such. And also the struggles for development among self-employed women, as I've already mentioned. Sewa was started by two Indian women in the 1970s. And in that sense, again, it does reflect this international women's movement from the 1970s, especially ratcheting up during 1975 at the Mexico City United Nations Conference and the NGO conference that took place beside that. By 1975, women's issues were really global issues about development, about peace, about opportunity, and about continued fight for rights in many different regards. In the United States, it pushed forward a great deal of policy change, even to the point of women having the right to get credit cards. So there was a lot of different things that were going on both globally and nationally. Next slide, please. The one thing that I would like to highlight, as if I could jump into any of the different things, different topics and different organizations. I mentioned SEWA already, but is women in development, is USAID. And USAID sources show up in two different collections very significantly. One is a collection from the National Archives and Records Administration, the NARA, and we have them directly from the women and the USAID organization. But Tinker also is highly involved in USAID. And I highlight this right now because if you've heard in the news about months ago, the president has decided to basically eliminate USAID. So this is an organization that was created in the 1960s that had a lot of development aid, that also had poverty reduction aid. And it's a very, very important institution for women. So if you were to just Google right now, USAID and women, you would see a plethora of different articles that are talking about how women disproportionately are going to be hurt by some of these changes. I've been approached by a few people thinking about this as an issue right now today that you can also look back at historically. So some of these things can also be analyzed through this database and these records. It's not the first time that women have had those challenges, and it's not probably going to be the last of being, the feminization of poverty, if you've ever heard that phrase, being the last to eat in the family and having some of the biggest burdens as far as their obligations with both paid work and family work. But adding to the files from Tinker's papers, this will give us kind of a cohesive vision of what challenges that they faced. The database is very long historically, not as long as the one you just heard about, but it's 100 years. So going back to 1919 and bringing it up to when we first began the project, there are a few things that are later than 2019, but nonetheless, you can see some of the documents as they are, from handwritten letters, as I said, to small time publications, to a whole different realm of topics. Next slide, please. So this is an article from now, right? USAID frees counting the global cost of chaos. And I've been speaking to a lot of people on this topic recently, from NGOs that are trying to step in, but really thinking about the plight of women. And I'll go to the next slide and spend a little more time on that. But this happened before. In the 1990s, if anyone knows about this global kind of relationship, the United States pushed for what ended up being called the Washington Consensus. And this led to structural adjustment, where the different governments had to tighten their belt. And tightening the belt meant less money was going to poverty reduction. It meant less money was going to education of girls and women. It meant less money was going to a lot of projects that had already been started from the 70s to the 80s. So if we reflect back and see some of these, movements that are ambitious to help women globally and to support them in where they're headed professionally and in their family life, we also have to think about the opposite change sometimes. And I think thinking about today and thinking about in the past really gives us a chance to contextualize so much. The database is very large. It's 150,000 pages. So there is really a lot to be able to explore in here. And a lot of topics from, as I said, USAID to the Peace Corps, to the United Nations, a Council for the Status of Women. There's another one that is a Latin American Women's Association, an organization that has been spanned for 100 years. So there's much to look at, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that anyone would have about projects or way to explore these different ideas and to bring the idea of women's movements into a global perspective. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Jensen. Thank you for walking us through that depth and range. It is really powerful to see these previously less accessible stories and archives and see how they can surface the voices of these women who have both shaped and challenged global development policies. So thank you so much for sharing that. Now to our final speaker, Dr. Carrie Baker, who will be sharing about the newly digitized Ms. Magazine archive and her work.
Great. Thank you so much. It's wonderful to be here today. So I want to first just say a little bit about myself. I have used archives in my research and in my teaching going back decades. My first book on the women's movement against sexual harassment was deeply archivally based research at Schlesinger, at personal archives, in government records. And I did a WASM document project on this book back in 2010 or so. My second book on fighting the US youth sex trade also was deeply archival. And then my most recent book, which I've published open access, Abortion Pills, US History and Politics, also is deeply archival. And I am working on a documents project related to that book right now. So Smith College has an archives concentration. It's like an applied minor where students do archival research, learn about the process of archival collecting. They engage in internships. And so I have, for instance, right now, our gateway class for the archives concentration. It has 48 students in it. And we're bringing in all kinds of people, donors, archivists, researchers, oral historians, to talk about what oral history is, how it's collected, how to read and interpret it. And certainly we have a lot of conversations about the digitization of archives and the importance as far as accessibility. We're here at Smith College. We have the Sophia Smith collections right here. And so we can go in and see a lot of it, live, but a lot of people aren't at places where they can do that. And even for our own students, it can be hard to get in there and pull out materials and search full collections. And so we use digital archives a lot in our teaching, and it's really important. It's made so much material accessible to our students. I want to talk about one digitized archive, which is the Ms. Magazine archives. For the first time ever, Ms. Magazine, the entire 53-year run, is available in a database. It provides unprecedented access to more than 50 years of the magazine's coverage, documenting the evolution of the contemporary feminist movement in the United States and globally. Ms. Magazine really narrates the women's movement kind of in real time, and it follows the debates, the disagreements, the thinking, the activism, the aspirations, the victories, and the losses. It documents emerging language and voices. There are letters to the editor. There's the famous no comment section. There was the first 15 years where there's advertising, and then there's the more recent with no advertising. And so it really offers a lot of opportunities for students to dig back into history and see how issues are treated over time. Can you go to the next slide? Thank you. So just to tell you where it is, it's integrated into ProQuest One Women's Studies and ProQuest Digital collections. It's available as a single title collection. You can go there and search the entire 53 years of Ms. Magazine, and new magazines are added in as they're published. The magazine is still published 4 times a year. There are permalinks available to specific articles, or you can just search the collection for a specific issue or topic. Next slide, please. This is what it looks like here at Smith. Our archivist has given us a permalink directly to this page. So from here, students can search the entire collection. And, you know, by the way, you see the covers here. Even an assignment looking at Ms. Magazine covers is really like a way of thinking about the evolution of the women's movement. Ms. was really the feminist movement's mainstream magazine. And you know, that was very fraught, and there were a lot of discussions and debates around that. But students can look at over time what feminists thought were important, how issues got framed. And I'll talk a little bit about you know, different kinds of assignments, but it really gives an opportunity to for students to put their fingers on the pulse of the feminist movement from the 70s into the 80s, into the 90s, and on into the 21st century. So I use these archives in a number of different ways. I assign articles that were sort of historically significant turning points in the women's movement. And, you know, I used to have to do it in, get it from anthologies, but now I can actually have my students go back to the original magazine and see how the issue was portrayed in the original magazine. Can you go to the next slide, please? An example is Johnny Tillman's famous Welfare is a Women's Issue. So this piece was published in spring 1972. It was really a groundbreaking piece for bringing a class analysis to the mainstream women's movement, pulling together racism, classism, and sexism. Johnny Tillman was one of the co-founders of the National Welfare Rights Movement. She was an activist that worked sort of across different groups of women. And this piece is such an important archival record of how early feminists were thinking intersectionally. You know, in the field of women and gender studies, we're always talking about intersectionality. I assign this piece because I think it's a really sophisticated, engaging, grassroots activist, not academic frame. You know, we read Kimberly Crenshaw, but then to put an article like this next to that academic theorizing intersectionality and let students see how it actually played out on the ground, you know, and how feminists actually mobilized intersectional thinking in the women's movement is a really powerful way for students to actually learn that concept at a deeper level. Next slide. Another really significant article is Cynthia Enlow's The Globe-Trotting Sneaker. So Cynthia Enlow, of course, is a professor at Clark and a longstanding women and gender studies scholar and teacher, but she also published in Ms. Magazine. And Ms., going back to the very beginning, had feminist scholars writing for the magazine. And this piece in particular was really significant. It was in the mid-90s because it was this, you know, at the time, the field of women and gender studies was really pushing towards global framing of of women and women's studies, and you see it show up in the magazine. And I assigned this piece, and by assigning it in its original incarnation, and then sometimes assigning it in the context of how did Ms. Magazine over time talk about global issues? Where were they at the very beginning, and how did they integrate global issues over time? I mean, the very first cover of the very first issue drew on Gloria Steinem's year-long travels in India. And so, you could talk a lot about how feminists in the 1970s engaged globally, and then how it shows up in the magazine. Can you do the next slide? So this is a piece that I actually wrote in 2010 in Ms. Magazine, and it was when the movement against child sex trafficking was first mobilizing in the United States. And again, it's really interesting to see how issues like child prostitution or commercial sexual exploitation of children in the 90s or child sex trafficking in the 2010s, how the framing of young people in the sex trade evolved over the course of the women's movement and why it evolves. So putting stories, from the 70s on a particular issue next to stories from the 90s, next to stories from 2010, you can see how feminist thinking and framing and organizing evolved across the women's movement. And, you can assign a series of articles like that, or you can have the students have a current topic that they're really interested in, and then go into that database and try to pull articles from different decades on that topic. How did feminists think about, in vitro fertilization or contraception or rape, for instance? I mean, Ms. Magazine had some of the very first cover stories on issues like sexual harassment in 1977, battered women in 1976, acquaintance rape in 1987. They often either coined the framing of the terms or they popularized feminists' coining of those phrases by publishing those cover stories, by talking about those issues, by following feminists working on those issues. So if you're talking about rape today, you can go back and look at how did the magazine think and talk about rape over time. Next slide. So this is just some examples. I've talked a little bit about contextualizing current topics, researching the evolution of feminist thinking on particular issues. You could also have students search Ms. for historical or contemporary feminist trailblazers that resonate with them. Faculty have sort of brainstormed with their students about, what famous feminists have you heard about? And then going into this archive and finding where those famous feminists show up in the 50 years of Ms. Magazine. An example is Angela Davis. She actually published an article about Joan Little back in the 70s. And then she, of course, herself was covered in over time and all the way up until the contemporary context. So thinking about important or trailblazing feminists and how their work is documented in the magazine over time. Another strategy is teaching media literacy. So, again, comparing Ms. Magazine to mainstream media. How did mainstream media talk about rape when Ms. was talking about acquaintance rape? Mainstream media was often framing rape as stranger rape, somebody jumping out of the bushes with a gun, whereas Ms. was talking about how most rape occurs by acquaintances, people your family members, and thinking about what difference does feminist media make? And how does mainstream media not incorporate feminist perspectives? So teaching them media literacy and being able to sort of understand how the source really shapes how issues are framed. You can also situate Ms. alongside other primary source materials. So, we have collections here, but of course there's all kinds of digitized collections that you can look at, so Ms. talks about an issue and then you can go back and pair that with some of the original source material behind that issue at the time. Next slide. So I'll also just say that Ms. Magazine itself has teaching resources to be used alongside the archive. So Loretta Ross and I, along with Karen Jolna at Ms., have published this resource guide, Reproductive Health, Rights, and Justice. And the guide has an introduction to a collection of Ms. articles from across the 50 years and helps faculty members think about how to teach those resources. And so this is just one example. Ms. has a number of different kinds of resource guides that helps faculty members or gives strategies or ideas for librarians or faculty members who are teaching these materials to think about how to do that in an engaging way, again, often alongside other primary source materials. Thank you very much.
Well, Dr. Baker, thank you for that very fascinating look. I'd love to see these emojis coming in. People are definitely responding to how you connect the media archives in your classroom experience and how you relate these archives to the ongoing public conversations that are happening today. So very inspiring. To Dr. Baker's point about situating these archives alongside other primary source archives, the content that we're seeing today, like the Irene Tinker Papers, the Women's and Social Movements in the United States and 1600 Journal, and also the Ms. Magazine archive. These are all available to cross-search together through ProQuest digital collections. If you are interested in exploring these and seeing how these work together, there's a poll question that you'll see that will pop up on the screen. If you select yes to that, that will let us know that you are interested in more information on how to start a trial so that you can explore these resources. There's also another question. We're interested in your voice. What topics would you maybe want to see covered in future primary source webinars that we share? As we move into the Q&A portion, I'm going to hand things over to our moderator, Samantha Lebrano. As I mentioned at the beginning, Sam is the product manager for some of the rich portfolio of primary source offerings from ProQuest, including women's studies. And to start things off, I'm actually going to send a question her way. Patricia's presentation highlighted some, Dr. Schechter's presentation highlighted some powerful examples of primary sources that document Black women's leadership and activism. And one of the examples that Dr. Schechter referenced was from the crisis. And I understand that the early years of this magazine is currently being digitized. So could you tell us, Sam, just a little bit about that project before you start the Q&A?
Absolutely. And thank you, Jody, and the rest of the panelists for being here today. We have, in fact, digitized the full run of the Crisis magazine in partnership with the NAACP. The Crisis covers the years 1910 to 1923, and it promotes Black literature, the arts, as well as advocating for civil rights. And as of this December, it will be fully available within ProQuest digital collections, ProQuest One History, as well as ProQuest One Black Studies. So with that, I'm going to shift over to the Q&A portion of this webinar. And I do see that a few questions came in. And the first one is going to be directed at Dr. Jensen regarding the Tinker's collection. And there's a couple questions, so I'm going to put them together. So the first is, have you digitized the whole collection, or were you more selective? And if so, what did you focus on digitizing? And then the follow-up to that is, what industries are represented in the Tinker's collection?
Thank you so much for the questions. Wow, this has been a long journey with Irene Tinker Collection. I think when I first started the whole database project, even before the pandemic, it was, we went to American University and we were looking through she has a collection there. That didn't work out, but I did find a second collection. The second collection was even larger and it was actually even more rich. So we were lucky to be able to move in that direction. We did not digitize the entire collection, but we digitized, I think that we were digitizing about 70,000 pages. So it was big. But there was some published materials that we had to get rid of. But really it was, Irene Tinker did a lot in her lifetime. She did more. It wasn't always about women. It was about women and men. It was about communities. It was about international relations. Much of her work was in policy, decision-making, and pushing towards a greater engagement globally, and collaboration with other women's groups. So what I did when I went through, I had to kind of start focusing specifically on women's employment, about women's economic opportunities, about paid and unpaid labor for women, and a lot having to do with really what the focus of the collection was going to be, was, what does development mean for women? And that was always a kind of a question about economic development, about social development, about other certain things. So I really did have to focus specifically on what was in the whole idea, the concept of the database in the first place. So, but there's within that, there's a great richness and a great diversity and a great, you know, there are literally women's organizations all over the world. You know, as I said, from Indonesia to, you know, Japan to Africa to Russia, you know, so she had a great deal. I think she was collecting all of this material, and thank goodness that this woman took the time from the, you know, the 1960s and 70s to collect all this incredible material that is oftentimes not in the historical record right now. There are women I know personally that are working on women in development projects and historicizing them, but this is just the beginning. I think there's so much more that we could do. And for the industries as well, it's interesting. There's a vast amount. I was just looking over some of the collection, and just an interesting one is women in coal mining in, you know, in Latin America. Right, and all these different things that they're doing, as I mentioned before, street food, you know, vendors on the streets from, you know, India to China and all of the things in between, Latin America as well. The self-employed women's organization I already spoke about. There's also all sorts of different organizations that really were pulling women together to stand up for their rights and to think about how they collectively can have a voice. So the industry really is also vast, but it's an incredible collection, and I think it will do a lot for women's history. Thank you.
Thank you. All right, so the next question, I'm going to direct this to all the panelists, is, are there certain publications or databases you would recommend for exploring women in Appalachian history, culture, and industrial labor? I do believe that we have a little bit of that across the board in each of the databases we talked about today, but maybe one or all of you can explain, or if you know, if you have more of that, those topics within those databases.
I'll just say briefly that if what's driving the question is the understanding that it's actually extremely difficult to generally document rural people, yes, very difficult. And so I think the way we navigate that in women in social movements is to focus by state. So we don't really do rural urban, but we try to have some balance by state. Now, of course, by state, urban voices may be stronger, right, in representations and searching by state. But that is at least one way to begin to crack that nut, so to speak. So the other thing that I think this is really near and dear to my heart, given the book I just wrote about a coal mining town, which is it's really important to help students think about, think beyond the binary of urban rural. And in fact, it's very difficult to categorize meaningfully, frankly, industrial sites like a coal mining town, because it can feel really urban. There's often a lot of train tracks and concentrations of wealth and a significant amount of commercial activity and banking, especially in the 19th century when the industries were starting up in the early 20th. So I try to have my students read for that, like read against the grain for urban-rural divides, rather than project the urban-rural divides onto our sources. So I'm not really answering the question all that well, but in terms of, you know, where to send you. But in other words, rural information can be embedded in urban sources because of the essentially false dichotomy on some level between like urban rural. It's like ingrained in modernist discourse that cities are distinct. It goes into the Enlightenment as well, and probably the ancient world as well. But those would be my two major responses. Look by state if you're doing a US search to try to find states that, you know, whose economy and whose maybe folkloric identity, mythic identity is more rural themed. themes, and then don't be fooled by urban sources, because they often city dwellers often have a lot to say about rural folk, so to speak. So thanks for the question.
So I would add, so I just searched the Biz magazine archive for Appalachian and women, and there are 19 articles. One, for instance, is Standing Our Ground, Women, Environmental Justice, and the Fight to End Mountaintop Removal from 2012. There are articles about, hold on a second, there was another one that was really, there's a lot about environmental, Hard Hats and Hammers, a job program that works. There are coal mining women, examining the recent history of women working underground in the mines. That was from 1972. And it's with an interview with the first woman miner hired in 1973. So there's just looking through and Mountain Voices, Appalachian Poets. This was published in 1976, Jacqueline Bernard. So I think it would be a really interesting assignment to have students look at Ms. Magazine and think about how have Southern women been covered, and in what ways, like at rural versus urban and across racial groups. And I think that would be a great assignment.
Thank you. And sort of in a similar vein to that previous question, across the databases, can you highlight, if you know of any content related to the history of women working and making advancements specifically in healthcare?
I mean, I'll just say Ms. covers that all the time and always has, whether it's talking about midwifery and midwives, it's talking about abortion providers, it's talking about nurses, and, everything from sexual harassment to working conditions to, hierarchies in the workplace that make it challenging to be nurses. I think that, again, and there is a question in the Q&A about searching. So you can browse individual issues, you can do a general search, but you can also do an advanced search, which has a whole range of search functions in it, like searching the author, the document text, the document title, the full text, anywhere but the full text, images, advertising, letters to the editor. I mean, so you can really hone in on different parts of the magazine to search in different kinds of ways.
Yeah, if I could chime back in, those are great strategies. Again, like the word voting versus suffrage, we talk contemporarily about voting, but in library world and in the historical past, the word suffrage was much more prominent. So too with the word healthcare. Healthcare comes out of our contemporary discourse. So if you search for things like nursing or settlement houses or reproduction or childbirth, babies, you may get more hits, right? But you're probably not going to find a lot of hits on healthcare because that's a very contemporary keyword. So my students and I out here in Oregon in 2004 did we basically did an archive. We processed a raw archive for the Oregon Nurses Association, which was a progressive era organization designed to advance the nursing profession and the majority women who were in it. And so there's a wonderful collection in Women in Social Movements on how did professional ideology shape the development of nursing in Oregon? So I'm not sure how many times the word healthcare comes up in the 40 interviews that we did with the women who were movers and shakers in that organization, but they certainly have a lot to say that's adjacent to the word healthcare, but they may not use that word in the way that we use it. So just creative, find those search strings that really get you the hits.
And if I could just extend that a little bit globally for a moment, the women's global health globally was a very, very important part of development programs. Whether it was overpopulation and trying to figure out, or the worry about overpopulation and trying to figure out how they could balance the rights of women globally with the ambitions of greater economy and less, starvation and all of those things. It was a big issue in the Peace Corps. It was a big issue for USAID. It was a very important issue for the women who were part of the Inter-American Commission for Women. And it was, on the ground, the projects that were put together. Interestingly enough, oftentimes, if it was the US being the donor, policies that were generated in Washington, D.C., but when you go to the ground, I always see this contrast between projects that are happening globally and the big ambitions for them. And the women, oftentimes, I'm working on an article now about the women who worked in these programs and how they needed to negotiate the needs of the local women and families and communities with kind of these broader ambitions about how they were kind of structuring aid programs and development programs.
Thank you. And I think we're getting close to time. I wish we had more time to delve into further discussions regarding primary sources and how you use them. But I think with this, I'll pivot back to Jody so she can wrap up. And if you have any other questions, please put them in the chat. Maybe we'll be able to respond to them later.
And I echo Sam's sentiment. There's never enough time when we get into these fascinating conversations. Thank you to all of our panelists who shared their insights and the strategies that they are using right now in the classroom. Thank you to everyone who joined us for this session today. We hope that you are leaving with new ideas for engaging with history in meaningful, student-centered ways. If you would like to follow up on anything that you have heard today or explore trial access, please do not hesitate to reach out. You can request a trial through the links that we have shared in the chat, and there'll be a final, I think, ending survey at the end that'll give you another opportunity. So thank you once more. Take care, and we hope to see you at a future session soon.
Great. Yeah, I'll just echo Jody and say thanks so much to everyone for presenting, and thanks to our attendees for your questions and comments. Just a reminder that we did record today's program, so be on the lookout for a follow-up email from Choice with a link to the recording. Also, if you have a few minutes after the presentation to fill out a brief survey, we would really appreciate it. So thanks again to all of you out there for joining us. We hope you learned something new from today's webinar and hope to see you again soon on another session. Thanks, everyone.